What happens when a television legend sits down for what should be a simple interview, but instead finds herself defending her entire career against accusations she never saw coming? What unfolded next would become one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history. Marla Gibbs, the beloved actress who captured hearts as Florence Johnston on The Jeffersons and Mary Jenkins on 227, walked into the studio that morning expecting nothing more than a typical promotional chat. At 92 years old, she had done hundreds of interviews over the decades and assumed this would be another lighthearted conversation about her new memoir and her groundbreaking career in television. Sherri Shepherd, known for her time on The View and her own daytime talk show, greeted Marla warmly backstage. The two women exchanged pleasantries about their shared experiences in the entertainment industry, with Sherri expressing genuine admiration for Marla's trailblazing work. Everything seemed perfectly cordial as they made their way to the brightly lit set, where an eager studio audience buzzed with excitement to meet the television icon. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to the incomparable Marla Gibbs," Sherri announced as the cameras began to roll. The audience erupted in applause, and Marla waved graciously from her chair, elegant in a powder blue blazer and pearls. Her warm smile radiated the same charm that had made her a household name for generations. Marla, it is such an honor to have you here, Sherri began, settling into her chair with an admiring smile. "I have to say, growing up watching you on The Jeffersons and 227, you were such an inspiration. You really paved the way for so many of us in this business." Marla's face softened. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth that viewers had loved for decades. "It's wonderful to be here with you. I've been following your career, and I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." The conversation began easily enough, with Sherri asking about Marla's early days in Hollywood and the challenges she faced as a black actress in the 1970s. Marla reminisced about her audition for The Jeffersons, explaining that she never imagined Florence would become such a cultural phenomenon. "You know, when I first read for that role, I thought it would be maybe a few episodes," Marla reflected. "But Florence had such a strong voice, such spirit. She wasn't going to let anyone walk over her. I think people connected with that strength." Absolutely, Sherri agreed. Then, after a brief pause, her tone shifted slightly. "And speaking of strength, I want to talk about something that's been on my mind." The room seemed to tighten with anticipation as she continued. "There's been some discussion lately about certain roles from that era and whether they perpetuated stereotypes." A flicker of caution crossed Marla's face. She had heard this line of questioning before and understood that while it was a valid conversation, it often lacked the nuance and historical perspective those years required. "Well, that's certainly a conversation worth having," she said carefully, "though I think it's important to understand the time period and what we were trying to accomplish." Sherri leaned forward, her expression intent. "But don't you think, looking back now, that some of those characters Florence in particular played into harmful stereotypes about black women? The sassy maid, the sharp tongue, always in service to white families." The studio audience grew quieter, sensing the shift in tone. Marla straightened in her chair, decades of experience helping her stay poised. "Sherri, I think you're oversimplifying what Florence represented," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "Florence wasn't just a maid. She was a woman who spoke her mind, who had dignity, who never let anyone diminish her worth. She was three-dimensional, not a caricature." But she was still serving a white family, Sherri pressed. "She was still in that position. Don't you think that sends a problematic message, especially when that was one of the few representations of black women on television at the time?" Marla's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the weight of decades in the public eye visible in her measured expression. What had begun as a warm reunion between two generations of entertainers was quickly turning into something far more charged and the audience could feel. Marla Gibbs had spent decades defending her work, explaining the context, emphasizing the progress it represented, and highlighting the positive impact her characters had on generations of viewers. But there was something in Sherri's tone that day, something sharp and pointed, that made it clear this wasn't just an intellectual discussion about representation in media. Florence was never subservient, Marla said firmly. If you watched the Sherri watched it, you'd see that she was often the smartest person in the room. She had the best lines, she drove the comedy, and she never, ever compromised her dignity. That character opened doors and created opportunities. Created opportunities for whom? Sherri shot back almost instantly. For the network executives who got to pat themselves on the back for including black characters while keeping them in traditional roles. For white audiences who got to laugh at the sassy black woman without having to confront real issues. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Marla's publicist, seated in the front row, shifted uneasily, realizing this was not the celebratory, nostalgic interview they had been promised. It was becoming increasingly clear that Sherri had come into the conversation with a very specific agenda. I'm starting to wonder if you actually watch the shows you're criticizing, Marla replied, her voice controlled but carrying a hint of steel. Because if you had, you'd know that Florence was revolutionary for her time. She was funny, she was smart, she was human. She wasn't a stereotype, she was a fully realized character. Revolutionary. Sherri repeated, her eyebrows raised. Really? A made character was revolutionary. The single word dripped with skepticism, and the dismissive tone seemed to hit Marla like a physical blow. Here was this younger host, someone who had claimed to admire her work, reducing decades of struggle, progress, and artistry to a cynical talking point. Marla's composure began to waver. You clearly don't understand what it was like back then, she said, her voice trembling just slightly beneath the weight of frustration. You don't understand what we were up against, what we had to overcome, or what those roles meant to people who had never seen themselves represented on television before. The studio lights seemed to burn brighter as the conversation's energy shifted from tense to electric. What had started as a polite exchange now felt like an interrogation. But Marla Gibbs wasn't about to let her life's work be dismissed so casually. I understand perfectly well what it was like back then, Sherri retorted, her own voice rising. My grandmother was a domestic worker. My great-aunt cleaned white people's houses. So when I see Florence on television cracking jokes while she's literally cleaning up after the Jeffersons, it hits differently for me. Marla's eyes flashed, a mixture of surprise and indignation. Then you should understand even better why Florence mattered, she countered, leaning forward in her chair. Your grandmother, your great-aunt, they deserve to see themselves represented with dignity, humor, and strength. That's exactly what Florence was. But that's just it. Sherri pressed on, her hands gesturing emphatically. Was it really dignity, or was it just making the audience comfortable with inequality? Making them laugh at the help instead of questioning why the help was necessary in the first place? The audience was completely silent now. Some people shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable as what was meant to be a tribute began unraveling into confrontation. Marla's publicist was frantically texting someone, likely trying to figure out how to salvage the situation before it spiraled further. You're putting today's lens on yesterday's reality, Marla said, her voice rising with conviction. We worked with what we had. We took roles that could have been one-dimensional, and we made them human. We made them matter. Florence wasn't just comic relief, she was the heart of that show. The heart of the show. Sherri repeated, incredulous. Marla, with all due respect, you were the hired help, making jokes about your employers. How is that the heart of anything except a system that needed black women to be entertaining while staying in their place? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Marla sat back in her chair, studying Sherri with new eyes. This wasn't just about television or representation anymore. It felt personal, targeted, and deeply unfair. Asterisk Sherri. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer, Marla said, her tone taking on the same quiet authority that had made Florence Johnston unforgettable. Have you actually watched full episodes of The Jeffersons recently? Or are you basing this entire conversation on clips and other people's opinions? Asterisk, for a brief moment, Sherri hesitated. And in that hesitation, Marla saw everything she needed to know. I've seen enough to form an opinion, Sherri said defensively, but her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. The damage, however, had already been done. That's not what I asked you, Marla pressed, her tone calm but unyielding. Have you sat down and watched full episodes? Have you seen the storylines where Florence stood up to George Jefferson when he was being unreasonable? Have you seen her refuse to be disrespected by anyone, regardless of their race or economic status? Have you seen her dreams, her relationships, her complexity? I don't need to watch every episode to understand what the character represented. Sherri shot back defensively. Actually, you do, Marla replied, her voice firm. Because what you're doing right now is exactly what critics did back then. You're reducing a complex, groundbreaking character to the most surface-level interpretation possible. You're doing to Florence what racist critics tried to do to diminish her to just a stereotype. The accusation clearly hit a nerve. Sherri's posture stiffened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a sharp edge. Don't you dare try to flip this on me, she snapped. I'm asking legitimate questions about representation and the impact of certain images in media. That's not racist, that's being responsible about the messages we put out there. Responsible? Marla repeated, her eyebrows arching. Is it responsible to tear down the work of pioneering black actresses without doing your homework first? Is it responsible to use your platform to diminish characters that meant everything to millions of viewers? I'm not tearing down anything, Sherri insisted. I'm having an honest conversation about how some of these old shows look through today's eyes. No, Marla corrected sharply. You're not having a conversation. Conversations require listening. Conversations require understanding context. What you're doing is lecturing me about my own career, my own choices, my own impact without bothering to understand what you're talking about. The audience sat in silence, transfixed. What was supposed to be a warm, nostalgic interview had turned into a live masterclass in how quickly things could unravel on television. Some in the crowd were visibly rooting for Marla, nodding along with her defense of her legacy, while others seemed to sympathize with Sherri's point about problematic representation. I understand more than you think I do, Sherri said, her voice growing sharper. I understand that sometimes our ancestors had to take roles that weren't perfect because those were the only roles available. I understand the compromise, but I also understand that we have to be honest about the impact of those choices. Our ancestors. Marla's voice dropped into a dangerous quiet. Sherri, I'm sitting right here. I'm not an ancestor. I'm not a relic from some distant past. I'm a living, breathing person who made choices based on the circumstances of my time. Those choices opened doors for people like you. I never said you were a relic. Sherri backtracked slightly, perhaps realizing she had gone too far. You didn't have to say it, Marla replied coldly. Your whole approach to this conversation has been treating my work like it's some embarrassing chapter in black television history that needs to be explained away or apologized for. Well, I'm not apologizing for Florence. I'm not apologizing for Mary Jenkins. I'm proud of those characters and what they represented. And what exactly did they represent? Sherri challenged her journalistic instincts, overriding her sense of caution. Marla turned her gaze toward the camera, her eyes fierce yet steady, as if speaking directly to every person who had ever watched her work. They represented women who refused to be invisible, she said with quiet intensity. They represented intelligence wrapped in humor. They represented dignity in the face of dismissal. They represented the truth that working people, black women, domestic workers all deserve to be seen as complete human beings with their own stories, their own worth, their own voices. But they were still in service positions, Sherri pressed, relentless. And what exactly is wrong with service? Marla shot back, her voice rising for the first time. What's wrong with honest work? What's wrong with characters who happen to work for a living? My mother was a domestic worker. Are you suggesting that her life, her dignity, her intelligence didn't matter because of her job? The personal nature of that revelation seemed to stun Sherri. For a moment, the entire studio went silent. That's not what I'm saying, Sherri murmured, her voice suddenly subdued. Then what are you saying? Marla demanded, leaning forward. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're ashamed of working people. It sounds like you think service jobs are beneath dignified representation. It sounds like you've bought into the very classism that Florence spent every episode fighting against. The balance of power in the room shifted completely. Mara leaned back in her chair, studying Sherri with a measured gaze that suggested she was making careful calculations about the direction this conversation had taken. Of course we deserved more, she said slowly. And we fought for more. Every single day on those sets, we fought for more depth, more humanity, more complexity. But you know what we didn't do? We didn't tear down the progress we were making while we fought for more. I'm not tearing down progress, Sherri insisted quickly. Really? Mara's eyebrows rose. Because it sounds to me like you're suggesting that my life's work was somehow harmful to black people. It sounds like you're saying that characters who brought joy and recognition to millions of viewers were actually a problem. I'm saying that we need to have honest conversations about these images, Sherri said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Honest conversations require honesty, Mara shot back. And honestly, Sherri, this doesn't feel like a conversation. This feels like a trial where you've already decided I'm guilty of perpetuating stereotypes. And now you're just looking for me to confess. The audience was completely captivated, witnessing what felt like a generational clash between two different perspectives on black representation and media. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed fascinated by the raw honesty of the exchange. That's not fair, Sherri protested. What's not fair? Mara countered, her voice gaining strength. Is inviting me here under the pretense of celebrating my career, then ambushing me with accusations about my impact on black representation. What's not fair is reducing decades of groundbreaking work to talking points you probably read on social media. I didn't get these ideas from social media, Sherri said hotly. Then, where did you get them? Mara challenged. Because they certainly didn't come from actually engaging with the work. They didn't come from understanding the historical context. They didn't come from talking to the people whose lives were touched by these characters. Sherri took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her tone was softer, more personal, even vulnerable. They came from my own experience, she admitted. They came from growing up and seeing my grandmother in those characters and feeling embarrassed. They came from wanting something more dignified for the black women in my family. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and sincere. For a brief moment, Mara's expression softened. Your embarrassment was never about my characters, she said gently but firmly. Your embarrassment was about how society treated the real women those characters represented. But instead of fighting that society, you're attacking the characters who dared to exist with dignity within it. I'm not attacking anyone, Sherri said, though her voice wavered. Yes, you are, Mara replied. You've spent this entire interview attacking the choices I made, the impact I had, and the characters I created. You've questioned my legacy, my understanding of my own work, and my contribution to Black representation, all while admitting you haven't even bothered to properly watch the shows you're criticizing. Sherri opened her mouth to respond, but Marla held up a hand. I'm not finished, she continued, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect on television sets. You want to talk about dignity? Let me tell you about dignity. Dignity is taking a role that could have been a throwaway maid character and making her the smartest, funniest, most memorable person on the show. Dignity is using comedy to illuminate truth. Dignity is opening doors for the next generation instead of slamming them shut on the previous one. I never said you didn't open doors, Sherri said weakly. You didn't have to say it, Marla replied. Your entire approach to this conversation has been about closing the doors I opened, dismissing the bridges I built, and questioning whether my work was worth doing at all. The studio had gone silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut away from what had become an intensely personal confrontation. You know what the real tragedy is here, Sherri? Marla continued, her voice low but edged with disappointment. You have a platform. You have an audience. You have the opportunity to lift up the next generation of Black actresses and honor the ones who came before. Instead, you're using your show to tear down the very foundation your career was built on. That's not what I'm doing, Sherri protested, but her words rang hollow. Then what would you call it? Marla asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me here to make yourself look progressive at my expense. It looks like you thought you could score points by attacking an elderly Black actress who can't fight back. The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Sherri's face flushed, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled. I never intended to attack you personally. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is the same, Marla said, standing from her chair. The movement was smooth and commanding, her presence radiating the same power that had defined her entire career. Marla, please, sit down, Sherri said, panic creeping into her voice as she realized the interview was slipping beyond her control. Let's talk about this. We did talk about it, Marla said, removing her microphone with practiced ease. And what I learned is that you're more interested in tearing down the past than building up the future. What I learned is that you think Florence Johnston was an embarrassment instead of an inspiration. I never said she was an embarrassment, Sherri said desperately. You didn't have to, Marla replied, her tone final. Your questions said it all. Your assumptions said it all. Your complete lack of preparation for this interview said it all. She handed her microphone to a stunned production assistant and looked directly into the camera one last time. To everyone who found strength in Florence, who saw themselves in Mary Jenkins, who understood that these characters were revolutionary for their time, thank you, she said with quiet dignity. Your understanding meant everything then, and it means everything now. Then she turned back to Sherri, who sat frozen, clearly unsure how to recover. Next time you want to have a conversation about representation and legacy, Marla said, her voice carrying the same sharp wit that had made Florence Johnston unforgettable. Maybe actually watch the shows you're criticizing. Maybe understand the history you're judging. And maybe remember that the women who came before you deserve respect. Not lectures from someone who hasn't done her homework. With that, Marla Gibbs walked off the set with her head held high, leaving behind a stunned audience, a speechless host, and one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history. The cameras kept rolling as Sherri sat motionless, staring at the empty chair where one of television's greatest legends had sat just moments before. What was meant to be a celebration of Marla Gibbs had become a masterclass in how quickly admiration can turn into confrontation, and how the fight for dignified representation continues to echo across generations.